Hello everyone, today we talk about the economy of the US Civil War. From last year I started this mini-series introducing the US Civil War. We did something similar with Vietnam. We're going slowly and we haven't started yet the in-depths that I'm probably going to start before we end this introductory series, because there's really a lot, right, in terms of well-documented, obviously, battles, campaigns, and so on. Some even the minor ones that were quite interesting, also to explore the doctrine of the era, etc. This background is necessary anyway, contextually speaking, obviously due to pecunia nervus belli. The American Civil War, as you know, became a sort of an all-out war, really. We can't use the term total in obsequium to von Clausewitz that explains us that that is really unattainable. And it's a misunderstanding also of the concept of absolute war that was used later and used in part, strangely enough, to also criticize von Clausewitz. Had nothing to do nor with the term nor with the meaning of absolute. And in any case, shows a massive commitment and mobilization of the United States of America. A war in which both sides mobilized their entire societies and economies. But the profound structural differences between the northern and southern economic systems are also the key. Not to it all, because again, it's primarily politics, strategy, right? The rhetoric of the lost cause is wrong in as much as the South did actually have a chance to win. I already obviously covered this very well-known topic, so I'm very aware that I'm talking as a European to an audience mostly of Americans, so that I will probably not be saying too much new from what you know, even though sort of newer generations have stopped really caring about so much of this form and substance. And this economical factors obviously did have a pretty strong influence on the capacity of each side to sustain the prolonged large-scale warfare over 4 years. And by mid-19th century standards, this is really impressive, especially in a country like the United States, where, as you know, there wasn't quite a thing like a fully fledged, sort of adequately scaled military before the war. And this also reflects, in fact, the enthusiasm, the political drive that brought also to the massive bloodshed. At the outbreak of hostilities in April 1861, the Union already possessed crushing advantages in industrial capacity, notoriously enough, financial infrastructure, as well as transportation networks. The northern states had developed a robust industrial economy in the very antebellum decades, driven by urbanization, immigration, and investment in factories, which contrasted sharply with the South's focus on slave-based plantation agriculture. The northern states maintained approximately 20 to 22,000 miles of railroad track, compared with only 9,000 in the seceded southern states, with an additional 1,700 miles in the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland that did not fully join the Confederacy. And the North controlled roughly 96% of the nation's railroad equipment, including 96% of locomotives, 1/3 of freight cars relative to southern totals despite the millage disparity, and vastly superior rail production capacity that ensured continuous replacement and expansion. This dense integrated rail system with standardized gauges in many areas and extensive lateral connections allowed rapid movement of troops, supplies, raw materials, and manufactured goods across a vast territory, obviously facilitating efficient logistics, even under wartime strain, and enabling the United States military railroads to operate captured southern lines as the world's largest railroad system by war's end, often converting them to uniform gauge for seamless integration into Union operations. This was very new, especially by this scale. The US Civil War is greatly defined, but different technological innovations that sort of took off in a very consistent sense, at least in military use and scale at this point. The southern lines, by contrast, often featured varying gauges that required offloading and reloading of freight at junctions, lacked sufficient interconnectivity, depended heavily on river transport that the Union Navy gradually ceased by 1862 per Anaconda Plan, and suffered from understaffing, as skilled workers were drawn into military service, leading to rapid deterioration without repairs or new equipment, compounded by the absence of domestic iron production to replace worn rails and rolling stock. The North's economy had diversified significantly in the antebellum decades as well, with substantial manufacturing concentrated in urban centers and supported by a growing free labor force, continuous immigrant inflows from Europe that swelled the industrial workforce, and access to capital markets that channeled investment into factories and infrastructure. Factories produced textiles, iron, machinery, firearms, leather goods, and other essentials at scales that dwarfed southern output. In 1860, for example, the North manufactured 97% of the country's firearms. As we just said, 96% of railroad locomotives, 94% of cloth, 93% of pig iron, over 90% of boots and shoes, and about 90% of overall manufacturing production, with 1.1 million factory workers compared to the Confederacy's 111,000 and 70,000 in border states, by the way. This overwhelming dominance in manufacturing stemmed from the North's embrace of sort of the Industrial Revolution, at least for reasons that were not sort of tied to any particular ideology per se, but to the obvious nature of the northern state, the Union states, and what they had developed like historically, including mechanized production and a shift towards wage labor, while the South invested heavily in slaves, whose total economic value in 1860 exceeded the combined worth of all the nation's railroads, factories, and banks, leaving little resources for industrial diversification. By contrast, the South had only about 20,600 to 21,000 factories, employing roughly 11,000 non-slave workers and generating $155 million in output compared with the 1.5 billion in the North, with industrial development hampered by undercapitalization, limited skilled labor, and a cultural preference for plantation agriculture over factory investment that left the region dependent on northern or imported machinery. As a consequence, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, the South's largest and most significant industrial facility and the third largest iron manufacturer nationally before the war, produced about half of the Confederacy's artillery and iron plating for the CSS Virginia ironclad, yet even the standout operation could not offset the broader regional lag in capacity. The Union population stood at approximately 23 million, or 22 million in free states, providing a large pool of military-age males and industrial workers, compared with the Confederacy's roughly 9 million total, including about 3.5 to 4 million enslaved people who could not serve as soldiers and whose labor became increasingly unavailable due to escapes and emancipation. The Republican-controlled Congress, unencumbered by Southern representatives after secession, enacted a sweeping program of economic modernization that served both immediate military needs and long-term national development. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened millions of acres of Western public land to settlers at minimal cost, encouraging agricultural expansion. As you know, this was a big deal, let's say, in the form of more individual autonomous entrepreneurship. The big debate among the various things had been about, whether to extend the latifundia to the west as well, and that's also part, in fact, of the U.S. Civil War causes. This act also incentivized population growth, thus also in free states, for example, and westward migration that bolstered food production and resource extraction essential for sustaining the war effort and post-war settlement. These measures sort of reflected already the lifestyle of many, I don't know, even the same Union commanders. Think about Grant's, by the way, disastrous entrepreneurial activity in the West before the war. The Memorial Land Grant Colleges Act, passed during the same 1862, allocated federal land to establish institutions focused on agriculture, mechanics, engineering, and military tactics, creating a foundation for technical education and scientific advancement that would support industrial and agricultural progress long after the war. The Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864 provided massive federal subsidies, land grants, and bonds for construction of the first transcontinental railroad completed in 1869, which linked eastern markets to the Pacific, accelerated commercial integration, and facilitated the movement of goods, people, and military resources across the continent. You understand how momentous, American economy was being at this point, how much the same war boosted it dramatically. High protective tariffs enacted through the second and third Memorial tariffs, building essentially on the initial one of 1861 passed in the waning days of the Buchanan administration, raised import duties significantly above pre-war levels, generating substantial revenue while shielding domestic manufacturers from British and European competition and helping offset the fiscal burden of new internal taxes. Financing the Union war effort required an unprecedented mobilization of resources, with federal spending reaching approximately $3.1 billion, and broader estimates, including state contributions and indirect costs, ranging up to from 6 to 18 billion in nominal terms, excluding long-term veterans' benefits. The government drew on three principal sources in a balanced approach that proved sustainable. Taxation accounted for roughly 21% of total funding. The Revenue Act of 1861 introduced the first federal income tax in U.S. history. By the way, initially a flat 3% on incomes above $800, equivalent to about $28,000 in modern purchasing power, with the burden falling primarily on wealthier urban households, as the average worker earned around $600 annually. Subsequent revenue acts of 1862 and 1864 broadened the base dramatically. Excises were levied on nearly every commodity, from liquor, beer, tobacco, cigars, salt, soap, paper, shoe leather, and flour, to luxury items such as jewelry and carriages, while the income tax became progressive, starting at a 3 to 5% on incomes between $600 and $10,000, reaching 10% on incomes over $10,000, and later adjusted further with emergency surtaxes. A national inheritance tax was imposed for the first time, and the office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue was created to administer the expanded system, growing rapidly from 3 clerks to 4,000 agents operating across 185 districts. Customs duties, greatly enhanced by the Memorial tariffs, as we've seen, formed another substantial revenue stream, contributing about 43% of federal tax collections between 1861 and 65. Borrowing supplied the largest portion, approximately 2/3 of war finance. Philadelphia banker J. Cook famously pioneered mass marketing of government securities, launching highly publicized patriotic campaigns that sold small denomination bonds, $50 and up, directly to middle-class citizens through installment plans, newspaper advertisements, and appeals to national duty, ultimately raising over $1.2 billion and covering about 2/5 of the federal budget. The national debt rose from $65 million in 1860 to roughly $2 billion by 1866. Yet the Union maintained credibility in domestic markets and secured limited foreign support, even primarily through firms like Barings for arms purchases. The remaining 13% came from monetary expansion via the Legal Tender Act, February 1862, which authorized issuance of fiat, so-called greenbacks, unbacked paper currency that merchants were required to accept at face value. Initial emissions totaled $150 million, with further authorizations bringing the total to about 450 to 500 million in circulation by the war's end. Although greenbacks contributed to inflation, obviously, consumer prices roughly doubled, for example, reaching 80% cumulative by 1865. The currency remained functional, widely accepted, and far more stable than its Confederate counterpart. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 further centralized the system by establishing federally chartered national banks required to hold government bonds as reserves and issue uniform national banknotes. A prohibitive tax on state banknotes in March 1865 effectively eliminated competing private currencies, creating a more standardized monetary framework that supported wartime industrial expansion and post-war economic recovery. The Confederate economy, by contrast, rested on a narrow, export-oriented agricultural base dominated by slave work plantations producing cotton, accounting for 3/4 of Southern trade in 1860, and supplying 2/3 of the world's cotton. At the same time, tobacco, 199 million pounds pre-war, sugarcane, rice, 187 million pounds, and other staples with local food crops such as corn, 280 million bushels pre-war, wheat, 31 million bushels, oats, 20 million, hogs, 15.5 million of them, interestingly enough, cattle, 7 million, and vegetables that nobody likes. If treated as an independent country in 1860, the 11 seceded states would have ranked as the world's fourth richest nation. Telling the truth. Yet this wealth existed primarily in illiquid forms. This is an issue that you find also in other wars of national unification or civil war struggles at this period. This was true, for example, for southern Italy in the very same years, that actually was very rich but did not have basically any investment, and as such was also pretty backward in a broader civilizational sense. The comparison with the Confederate South is quite interesting. We will surely make some videos about the Italian wars of independence, mostly the Italian unification, also the repression of brigandage in the South. So this is quite fascinating in many ways, and in liquid forms really mean land and approximately 4 million enslaved people, as we've seen, leaving little ready capital for war finance as such. Pre-war manufacturing was minimal, with only about, as we've seen, few tens factories versus 100,500 to 110,000 in the north, employing roughly, again, 11,000 non-slave workers and generating just 1/7 of the north output. As we've seen before, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond did quite help, but overall industrial capacity in the South lagged generations behind Northern and European standards, with limited skilled labor, undercapitalization, dependence, as we've seen on also Northern or foreign import, different components, and so on. The Union blockade, enforced from summer 1861, the initially and as famously self-imposed cotton embargo intended to coerce European intervention via the King Cotton so-called diplomacy, reduced cotton exports almost entirely, by about 95%. In fact, production totaled roughly 6.8 million bales from 1861 to 1865, but only 500,000 reached Europe, almost 1 million to the north, often through illicit channels or captured areas. 0.4 million were consumed domestically, 3.3 million were destroyed to prevent Union seizure, and 1.8 million remained hoarded for post-war sale as well. Revenue from import and export duties collapsed. Customs yielded only about 3.4 million over the entire war, far below expectations of 25 million in the first year alone. Direct taxation proved politically unfeasible, in the South due to states' rights ideology and the assumption of a short war. A war tax enacted in 1861 covered property, including slaves, but was collected with great difficulty, contributing only to about 5% of total revenue. Only in 1863-64 did a tax in kind, 1/10 of agricultural produce, become meaningful, indeed for, again, such an overwhelmingly rural economy, supplying roughly half of army provisions when valued in currency equivalent, yet overall taxation never exceeded 5 to 8% of Confederate funding. Borrowing provided about 35%, through domestic bonds, including produce loans redeemable in cotton, tobacco, or food, and limited foreign issues such as the 1863 Erlanger cotton loan in Paris, which raised roughly $14.5 million in gold, but was not repeated due to mismanagement, declining confidence, and reluctance from major European bankers like the Rothschilds. European markets, especially London and Paris, grew increasingly skeptical after defeats at Gettysburg, well, that's kind of obvious, Vicksburg in July 1863, when Confederate bonds in gold fell, in fact, to 47% of nominal value and continued downward, just like the Southern military spiral itself. Over 3/5 of Confederate finance derived from printing unbacked paper money. The money supply increased approximately 20-fold between 1861 and 1865, while the Lerner Commodity Price Index rose from 100 in January 1861 to over 9,200 by April 1865, equating to more than 9,000% cumulative inflation, averaging roughly 26% monthly, which is insane, right? Prices responded sharply to battlefield news with major spikes following Gettysburg and Vicksburg, equally speculative to the bonds as we've seen before, and further acceleration after the fall of Atlanta in 1864. Counterfeiting exacerbated the problem as crude Confederate notes were easily duplicated and currency became effectively worthless by the war's end, forcing reliance on barter in many areas that naturally also were devastated but didn't really have much of a functional economy to begin with. Now, the blockade severed access to manufactured goods in international markets, compelling the South to redirect agriculture towards food and munitions, yet severe droughts in 1862, labor shortages, transportation breakdowns, and impressment of supplies at fixed low prices created acute scarcity. Urban-bred riots erupted across the Confederacy in early 1863, with the largest in Richmond on April 2nd, involving thousands, primarily women, by the way, who looted stores for food, clothing, and shoes amid prices that had risen tenfold since 1861. Similar disturbances occurred in Atlanta starting as early as March the 18th, with groups seizing bacon and other staples. Mobile, Salisbury, High Point, Augusta, Columbus, Macon, and other cities, driven by refugee influxes that swelled urban populations, Richmond grew from 38,000 in 1860 to over 100,000 by 1863. Right, is gathered essentially all these people due to resources concentration and the terrible living conditions in many parts of the Confederacy, harsh winters, muddy roads, impending supply, government policies prioritizing army needs, and the combination of blockade effects with impressment and inflation. Railroads deteriorated, as we've seen before, without being left without repairs or new equipment, as most men were conscripted, with feeder lines cannibalized for trunk routes as well. And draft animals declined sharply due to requisitions, epidemics like glanders, and union destruction policies. The loss of slave labor through escapes, emancipation after January 1863, and flight to union lines further eroded productive capacity. Obviously, enough in consequence, the union not only sustained a force of over 2 million men, but also experienced economic growth in the meanwhile. Industrial output expanded, with sectors like weapons, iron, textiles, etc., surging under government contracts, agriculture prospering amid high prices and accelerated mechanization, reapers, threshers, and mowers spread rapidly, for example, as labor shortages drove adoption. And this is something we've seen also in other times of the Middle Ages, the technological innovation. At least in this case, as you see, the Union was doing well, but among the various things, very different times from pre-industrial times. But it's from crisis that sort of qualitative improvement is temporarily sought after. In any case, sort of during the various industrial revolutions, things were to skyrocket anyway, allowing also thus fewer workers to produce more grain and livestock. This was naturally possible because the North also had properly the means to provide with that, even in a war economy, with northern states producing, in fact, half of the nation's corn, 4/5 of its wheat, and 7/8 of its oats in 1860, trends that intensified during the war even. There is also private investment continuing despite heavy taxation and borrowing, as we've seen before. The North's private sector flourished, with new factories opening weekly in places like Philadelphia, and the war refining technologies such as notoriously railroads, we're seeing the beginning steamboats, telegraphs, and printing presses that supported broader post-war expansion too. The Confederacy, despite early military successes, as you know, could not overcome certain structural vulnerabilities. At least they could have still, again, made it in a political, strategical sense. Right? Also, the Union may have failed accordingly from the other side. But obviously, this starting point did not help the South. Its economy contracted into near collapse, marked by widespread malnutrition, desertion driven by home front hardship, and eventual ruin. The war thus resolved into this heavy, sort of disproportionate contest of economic endurance, among the other things. The North's diversified, industrialized, and financially adaptive system prevailing ultimately over the South's rigid, export-dependent, slave-based system, sealing the outcome long before the final military surrenders. So this was a fairly short video. We don't use that much anymore. The other day I made almost 3 hours of video, so this sort of compensates for it, but we have to fill it with something because at least I want to arrive to the hour. And I would like to focus here. You understand the picture is quite flashy. It's actually a lot of specific data that show you more like the scale, the proportion than the evidentiality of it all. At this point, how many videos do I have on the American Civil War? Wow, really? I haven't done this playlist yet? No. Oh, well, you know, and so we made probably just a handful by now. 1, 2, 3 only. This is the fourth. So, yeah, we're right around there, and it will continue naturally also in more strictly military terms. You just have to talk about this in general because I think it's hyper useful. I unfortunately don't see many people accessing my content, especially, you know, after the month passes and YouTube usually shows you a bit of, you know, the newer videos. People don't go dig into the enormous amount that I make. So I realize that people are attracted mostly like to not necessarily flashy stuff. I'm not making this sort of short format for this introductory series to the US Civil War for the sake of, let's see if the algorithm catches that better. It is mostly because I want it to be clear and simple for anyone that is starting just to know this chapter in military history and wants to have sort of an overall picture. But I think we never really made anything similar to this. We also have at this point some substantial amount of United States of America's warfare. All right, we have almost 20 videos about it already. It's not much, right? We have thousands, so on. So we have to catch up with that. We have to catch up, especially with 19th century warfare. That's by far the one that we haven't covered from the Common Era onwards. That really deserves. Right, last year I increased a little bit the count. I also launched last summer a poll asking you what kind of era you would like to see better represented, and I've gotten ancient 28%, medieval 41%, modern 18%, and contemporary 13%, right? So it's not like altogether this modern contemporary surpasses the ancient one. So I realized that people they like mostly early modern warfare, etc. But I also noticed, I always say it in the channel updates, that more or less this proportion reflects the type of content that I've always made on the channel normally. And in fact, these numbers, if the poll keep going, because it's basically just open still, like there is not a deadline where it shuts down. Probably that's going to be modified in the results according to the same, right? So people are interested and they are fundamentally curious about stuff. It's difficult, of course, to provide with new, fresh content that people are willing to watch so simply. The American Civil War provides you with this enormous set of political, sort of strategic, tactical, technological, economical, social issues that hardly any war probably has been analyzed, like considering the times and places, like, right? It's very unique. It's very, I don't think that, I don't know, as far as I see from political commentaries, that Americans even talk too much about the Civil War, right? They have it just like this thing looming over them because of certain sort of political reasons that they decided to sort of overly emphasize, also downplay for depending on really what we're talking about. It's a very complex and complicated story. Also, the relation that Americans have with the past. But in this sense, it doesn't seem to me, like any other people for that matter, it doesn't seem to me that there is actually a culture about it. That there is much of a, okay, let's sort of, I don't know in school whether they teach this stuff or not, or if it is, by this point, just ideologism, as it's been complained about. That's something that sometimes it's been like, I don't know, many people say, oh, so Europe went woke and crazy and whatever. I personally didn't experience this. Of course, it was now a while ago. But I also see that in the average discourse, yes, you do see people through the internet getting strange ideas in mind, but it's not like anyone also here like really cares about the history of anything, or that this is like a normal object of debate. It seems to me that especially younger people are completely uninterestedly collapsing in terms of historical awareness and capacity, even just to criticize, to work with it, etc. So obviously it's not much of a good thing, right? I don't know when I'm going to make sort of more videos about specific battles and campaigns. I have really an enormous but infinite amount of material to research from, and so I think it's going to be fairly easy, and I hope at some point we can have, because this was a great dream ever since I started Schwerpunkt, like a pretty robust level of American Civil War kind of content, because really knowing it better also from my side has always been a dream personally. Militaria, and it's one of those, together with the British Empire, like those things that really have to bridge several gaps with. And I hope that, again, these videos help. As you know, I've grown myself into and through the channel in ways that I didn't think it would be possible originally, right? You don't know, especially nobody does what I'm doing in terms of making videos almost every day, just for the sake of it to some extent. But then I realized that in fact it sort of enormously fortifies you. It gives you a perspective on even how people react or cope with this that is unique, right? If you really want to sharpen your critical skills, this activity is enormous. If anything, because you know why? Because you have to explain that. It's not even reacting to people, whatever. It's truly about the fact that every time you sit here, you have to explain things to people. And it's a challenge in and of itself. It's never easy, because it's not like history is made by basically saying, okay, well, I wish to talk about this stuff and I'm simply going to do it, right? You have, of course, to document yourself, you have to have some minimal education on it to begin with, but also and especially you must, at the proof of the facts, this is not about reading, you really have to work the information for the script, for essentially like what is that I want really to say here, like what is the overall, what is the important aspect, because at the end of the day that's also the point. Like if you start going off tangents or secondary aspects, and except of course like the level of depth, especially on Schwerpunkt, has always been in individually thematic sense very important, and can say primary, but as you've seen, I've been also trying to make some more bigger topics at some point, because we really lacked those ones, having made much more sometimes about the secondary ones. It's as if I had started here the history of the US Civil War. It's the first time I addressed it, as I was saying, this sense, like without having given this overall background. For the Middle Ages, I said, okay, I made so many videos about it that doesn't matter. Like we're covering everything, all at once, like steamrollers. But with these new topics, I have been strategizing a bit more over time, and I think it's better, right? It's very useful, and it sort of offers those fundamentals. And military history sort of flips much of the story as well, meaning that if you, as I insisted before, on like if you stick just to the socioeconomical side of the story, you will never understand how a war is fought or lost, right? There is this understanding that basically, like in this case, I don't know, since the entire American economy was radically skewed in favor of the Union, then the South did not stand a chance and or could not wage a war functionally or whatever. That's not what they lost on, right? That was primarily, again, a political and strategic reason, and not one that you can argue also went beyond many other aspects. So that's always the key for realizing how things really went. And until you see this from the battlefield, you can't really get it. You can't really get how much of a difference a single battle made, right? And how at some point advantaged even the South was from a military point of view, right? And you know better than me what I'm talking about at this point. So to never underestimate evidential history, because that's really the first thing. You can't really go on just looking at things in a sort of abstract structural sense, like out of the box of the sort of where they took decision, the think tanks, the general mood, the spirits. As you've seen here, the South went through like pretty harsh living conditions, rapidly deteriorating economic capacity, etc. So that is literally what eventually influenced the outcome of the war as well, but not because they hadn't taken this in consideration before. In fact, as we've seen, there was sort of a large feeling, at least, that the war could be settled briefly, right? It was an invitation even for the Europeans to step in, so that otherwise they thought like the economy would be world economy to a sense would be engulfed, and instead, right, it was a great resilience and adaptation, and most that was made up by the Union as well to cope with the situation, also for their own political end, right? So that's why we will enter at some point probably that political and also international mechanism, because the sort of this is mostly understood almost in an isolationistic thing as a sort of an inner war, right? But still, and always, ever since the foundation of the United States and before, European powers, even in a moment in which, of course, the United States were by now established without much reversal possibility, had like pretty heavy weight on how things could actually go, right? There were interesting comments. I remember, I think last year in 2024, when I started the series, that were referring to the fact that, of course, like the idea of also about the structuring of the Union in general, of at least, let's say, the American nation, through, for example, the continuation of the sort of slaveholding, the latifundio, large estates economy, and so on, was not warranted, right? Things could have actually gone otherwise. Famously, also later down the line, yet another civil war was about to break out. These are also pretty recent times. I mean, some of the people who had fought there were still alive during World War II, so obviously not on the front lines, kind of large, but that's something, again, that you must always keep in mind whenever you approach this topic. So the first, I already made a video explaining the causes of this divorce. You can find that pretty well in a broader political sense, also in a communitarian sense. I mean, the Americans, as you know, had been properly settling as from different parts of the old continent in ways that were, in that sense, deeply not just autonomously minded, as also in part, of course, like the same way that the United States had been born, and the various that the federal nature of the polity had maintained, but in this sense took things very seriously. For example, from a moral point of view, a religious one, right? There were different denominations that took side for this or that, also within fighting against literally one another. Were foreigners who also fought during the war, and that were transposing their own internal rivalries and what they thought they to see, also correctly to some extent, within probably the Civil War in America, as sort of different models of fighting. What strikes you really about this war is how recent it is, right? Which is also very much well served as an impression by all the magnificent photographic legacy that was levels of the terrible scenes of the devastations of this unprecedented war that, again, to many extents, it also inspired, as you know, think about Jules Verne, some of the true properly, also the idea of technological scientific process through military development, which is from the earth to the moon, notoriously the theme of it all. Especially artillery in that case. It was one of my favorite novels when I was little. There is this obvious, also Clausewitzian paradigm, right? Because at this point, von Clausewitz was not really translated and read abroad, right? You would think that some, I don't know, Unionist or Confederate general had read von Clausewitz for some reason. There were lots of Germans in interest, but say, things traveled, but it's not until the Franco-Prussian War that von Clausewitz reached some sort of greater global fame, even though it would never be adopted by various, fully adopted by the various armed forces as a foundational, existential almost doctrine. We've seen how the Europeans thought quite poorly of the Americans in terms of military quality, simply because, again, the Americans did not really have an army, or at least they had achieved, of course, important results, especially against Mexico. But overall, it's not until the Civil War that things really escalate to real substantial power and still maintaining some interesting limitations, even in perspective. We also have made videos about Mahan, as a matter of fact, and lots of other things that happened later. Right, but also the same connubium between Lincoln and Grant is so very deeply Clausewitzian by definition. Right, we also talk a bit about the strategic sort of picture, like how everything fared, even in terms of manpower and the capacity of the North to inject this enormous amount of resource. Again, against the South, that was counting rightly on quality. Right, and making, however, a type of war that was still stuck to some sort of, not necessarily earlier minded sort of vision of the world compared to the Union. But the Union had the means to take the step forward in that moment. Right, and you realize, by the way, that this war was so complicated that there wasn't really, there can be a unitary narrative, but it's not like it's just one cause, one consequence, etc. Like it's an incredibly complex and big system, as we've seen. The American economy was already pretty big globally wise, right? We've looked at the issue of the slavery, emancipation, etc. And today, as you've seen, we have essentially looked mostly at this idea of complete mobilization, the fact that the Union and the Confederacy really put all they had into this massive clash, right? That brought about like the depth of destruction, so much humanity, that was really shocking at the time. But this also shows you, this is very important in historical perspective, always how deeply motivated this war was, right? From both sides, there was probably an enormous stake here to consider for the development of the country, and something that in fact changed the United States forever. So we've seen loans, taxes, the reflection, as seen, of the sort of the immediate devaluation of the Confederacy state bonds and skyrocketing of inflation after Gettysburg and Vicksburg. That is sort of quite relevant. The probably money for the war, the greenbacks and so on. I think, I don't know how many other chapters I'm going to make about this. I would like to make, first of all, one, probably in this introduction will not be covering battles per se, but I think one good and obvious necessary sort of aspect, they're all entwined. Today we partially hinted at this, for example, are the new military instruments, right? The fact that actually the old rifles resisted, right? We also made, by the way, a minimal comparison with what had been happening in the 50s with the Crimean War. That really had brought Europeans to think a lot of very interesting things. Then at this point, it would be the second Italian War of Independence. It was also particularly insightful from a doctrinal point of view. Europeans were really studying their own much bigger and sort of more professional way of making war in a doctrinal sense and beyond. And they underestimated the Americans, right? By the end of the war, what the Americans had managed to pull off as a whole from this principle of complete inadequacy and amateurism in particular was really impressive, right? Technology, industrialization, logistical means that nobody had really seen before, right? This presented to the world an enormous collection of military novelties, even though, as always, never think that they alone had a decisive impact on the course of the war. Not just the two contenders essentially fought in the same way, but overall, technology is never the answer per se, right? It serves purposes, but it's not even all the technologies of the war put together, coming anywhere near any significant section of the world balance, right? And you have also, we will talk actually about battles. We've already done that at the beginning. For example, we talked about Shiloh. We talked about the first Bull Run, right? So every once in a while, we'll use those as looked at, this battle told them essentially that. And then at some point, we'll make the video about the campaign and battle all in depth, right? Which is, again, what I'm really looking forward to, because I think it's really amazing. And it could also change a bit, like, not the face of Schwerpunkt, but I'm offering something that I never offered before. We will talk about Wilson's Creek, for example. That's very important. The entire point of the Overland Campaign, for example, like there are these very specific kind of also the same Atlanta scorched earth that the economic effects of which we were observing today. But the question is really big, right? Really a major issue, and also training issues. There were some mistakes overall that were done. Not everything is 100% always linear or logical or whatever. Naturally, at the end of the day, the most important thing is Grant's turning point, so to say. When you look even at all this unbalance, this asymmetry that we talked about, when you look at the numbers, like the North 2 million and something, the South 1 million and something, you realize, again, it's not a decisive divide. We've seen the North produce virtually all guns in the United States, and yet, of course, the Confederates managed to fight and win for a prolonged time as well. And then also they basically destroyed themselves with wrong decisions to a degree, and some level of sort of overall strategic inertia or lack of creativity and further stepping further. And those are the sophisticated things you can't talk only when you basically get to the point, really. And actually, the Union went pretty heavy-handedly on the Confederacy, also for obvious reasons. And it's almost paradoxical that, of course, the South was sort of hoping, was sort of betting on the pacifists in the North, obviously, that could essentially put an end to the war, could convince the Union to stop. And this is something incredibly relatable, like as we have dramatically seen with the revival of warfare on a very big scale in the recent years in the world, where you realize that, most of the time people talk about history, it's just these two guys fought against one another, as if it's just the armies, the numbers, whatever. But that the politics is dominant, and that there are so many different groups from both sides that are pushing actually against the respective war effort for different reasons, but they were not even so simple to accept. Like, there could be idealism, or could be just political convenience. As always, it's rather all very ideologically mixed, baked together. And at that point, in fact, what I think is more than the reasons of the Union's victory, that I think are very also important and fascinating, and again, incredibly interesting. I think I will dedicate a video about that alone. And then I will dedicate a video to the mythology of the defeat. Because, as you know, that's arguably at least also in expandable political terms, the most important topic about the U.S. Civil War. All right. There are so many different issues, like in this, like, I don't know, the Southern narrative, the contribution of colored troops, and also just symbolic things. If we think about Appomattox's courthouse surrender, etc. Like the American recipe of this, and how, of course, the country made it out of the war, and that's also a major issue, a major sort of feat actually to pull off, but still with massive scars and, again, unsettled issues. This happens also in other countries in the world. It's also something that really ties to the protagonists of this, to the people who really had that happen in both political and military terms, and that's the most sort of higher level of the story, right? For the rest, again, it's so, I don't know, probably in the next, maybe by spring we'll finish this, so we can start talking about the heavy guns, so to say. I don't know where to start from, by the way. It's probably going to be relatively random, and we may even start before that to talk about certain of these battles in greater depth, because, again, I think they're very beautiful. There is a lot to cover, and as always on Schwerpunkt, we will not go in order, whatever. No, that we will remain canonic. We will stick to our tradition, because indeed it's more like about thickening the net, and also just how you approach Schwerpunkt, finding this content in a relatively random way, right? That's a bit the channels. Like, I do have lots of playlists that are, yes, like designed, structured to properly facilitate search and so on. But let's say the way you can come across my content in a more regular YouTube fashion, like, can be and will be very interesting, I think, if you have also the patience of following me like this. Because among the criticism we were addressing yesterday as well, there's always a sense of, like, this guy, has to explain you his next 20 videos what he really means by this stuff. But it's actually true. Like, and this also derives from the fact it may be frustrating to, let's say, having to recompose all of this, and most people are just, especially those who don't have or not in great faith, may have a broader difficulty. But because every video is has very definite boundaries that are specifically designed not to go off topic and to concentrate and to settle the matter that you address here. Then, of course, when you make thousands of videos, I also personally, I don't have to repeat myself all the time. For the rest, we finally have some sort of presentable 19th century history, mostly warfare content. Again, perhaps not so presentable as we would like to, but again, we will surely go ahead with this. We have to talk a bit more national stuff, individual national European events, like especially the Poles, the Italians. We talk a bit about Germans. We talk a bit about the French. We also talk about British history that, as I was saying before, we have to go a bit more into. And then, yeah, that's the biggest void, I think. Yeah, 20th century history, we have 50 videos. It's not too much, but it starts truly being something. And 18th century, probably also not too much, but as always, like not even 40 videos that we also must continue really to look at. And yeah, that's the mere stuff. But you see, that's the weird thing. You have to go through the hardships, as you know, people don't like this preferentially compared to medieval. Ancient is going to likely remain. At some point, probably things will balance up altogether. In fact, for this reason, if I make videos about the 18th century or whatever, it's not as they're not going to be as watched immediately, at least compared to the others. But I'm really glad, at least, that in the last couple of days we've had a bit more of overall drive. You see, when I make those videos, like, I don't know, the Celto-Italic ethnic linguistic similarity, that's gotten lots of videos. The one I made yesterday, of course, was a banger because just it's so controversial. It's aimed at provoking people. Let's be honest. It's always been the case. But you see, you can't make videos like that all the time. Also because otherwise you would risk sounding hyperbolic, and more hyperbolic than you already are. But you see, that's the strange thing. The video in between, those last two, the medieval German and Hungarian warfare between 1000 and 1300 got, like in a day, not even 500 views. Why? You see, it's of the same mold. Like, you can't say, well, this video is fundamentally different. It's actually also better. It's also actually more explanatory to some extent. But I'm sure that also this one about the US Civil War, people will watch more. At least I've seen that could be another workhorse that we could use to get more views, to then eventually expose people to other topics, because that's also a bit the bottom line, right? You can't just bait people into these topics. Into the topics they don't want to watch. But if you, in fact, use as a bait some other videos, and then you know that at least somebody's going to be exposed to the rest of what you do, there are higher chances that people are going to be to get interested in that, right? And we're changing something, because I don't know, the millions of views we already made. At this point, it's mostly a matter of sort of having the algorithm starting, and it's not easy at all. If I had, for example, made with these numbers last year, before the algorithm change in February, March, a video like this would have gone at this point, I don't know, 10,000 views overnight. It's all more difficult at this point, and it's not like, it's weird, because again, there are those videos that still hit the mark. Like, they're probably not even necessarily the best videos, nor the most insightful. That's the thing that really makes you think, because I don't think that, let's say, real quality is simply real work, right? So real achievement and actual proper stuff is may simply be discarded per se. I think that all the videos I've made not just have contributed, as I was saying, to what I'm making in general, like to be better, more accurate, more objective, but they have also they're at some point going to be reevaluated, right? I have this idea that at least everything, also the rest of the channel, the rest of the videos, how they're faring, etc., like they are deeply how to say this, like they are deeply entwined with the quality also of the videos that are not watched. And so there I mostly see this as a particular achievement, and I'm glad that we can continue along this line admittedly, and we never know. Like at some point, probably I will start talking about some things that I will have to completely shut any sort of outer contact of the channel, etc., with other platforms, with privacy sector, because it's going to be heavy. It's going to be a lot of sort of ideology, a lot of say not from much from my side, but let's say targeting the channel, at least attempting at sort of misrepresenting it. And so at that point, I will probably get more exposure for not for rage or whatever, but let's say it's going to be extremely more common to have people probably living in the outer world thinking things that a channel does not necessarily say. This is a problem that most creators really have, that their content gets continuously misrepresented, continuously but people are, I don't know, I was talking about it yesterday in the video about the psychological bias of the overstatement of Byzantine power and so on. But like it's evidently an issue, right? It's not about the history of it. It's also the history of it, but let's say mostly touching on somebody's pressing somebody's buttons that frankly like set them pretty weird fashion, and that's where the malevolence, right, stems from. And that's the main issue, the main problem. Because I don't think that people are fundamentally stupid. There are very few people that send out, okay, let's say this person is actually dumb, right? They just don't get it, right? Others are even maybe worse because they are, they do get it, but they falsify the picture on purpose, and that's really what we're going to try to highlight as well in our videos, because that offers us such an enormous, like yesterday's video was entirely made out of this, like all the things you hear every once in a while about the Byzantines and how this vision of the Latin Germanic was, that mounts, that collects sort of stuff along the way for you to put together and to make videos like that. And I think that those videos are important because they are very archetypal deep inside. I think that people Jungianly revolve around those topics the most because they expect some kind of higher, knowledge or explanation or settling of the matter. I, again, studied topics like that for a long time. It's not even just a topic because it's difficult to find an actual academic branch that dedicates itself exactly on, for example, the overstatement of Byzantine civilization over the Latin Germanic West. But that's exactly the point. Like, if you have enough sort of abstraction capacity, you know enough about the Middle Ages as a whole, and which is rare. I found out through my medievistic career that it is actually really difficult to know the Middle Ages well in depth, because if you don't do basically what we're doing here, by at least with all YouTube's limitation, on top of that, as I at least learn stuff also in very different ways. It all is put together, however, in a way that I don't know even any of my colleagues doing so. I mean, this fact of covering state by state, character by character, battle by battle, that's something just people don't do. Like, medievalists are not trained, are not educated. They don't learn like that. Nobody does, arguably, like also in our field. So that's why I think these topics are important, because they're big enough, but there is an original synthesis that you will never find literally anywhere. This is also difficult, in fact, for the listener, because the points of references I call are sort of difficult to grasp, to get. All right, so we will again see what happens, how it goes on. I understood naturally here that the Indo-European history for some reason is the most watched, but we're going again to make more and better as time goes. This has always been the channel pace. We've always improved, and we've seen the results of that. So I don't have any doubt that this is going to get far, and that we're gonna really tell history in ways that people have never heard of, but still with that specific kick for concreteness, objectivity, accuracy. That's what people really want. Not all little things on big things, because those are the bigger questions that are the more important one. It takes really a long work to put it all together. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.